At the end of last week, we'd gotten into discussing how the Supreme Court tends to look at the issue of discrimination. And I want to back up a little bit and kind of tie it all back together as we move on into today's lecture. And the first thing I want to reinforce or re-mention is that discrimination, right, is what law does. It discriminates between actions. That's the point of it. So the fact that we pass legislation that right is going to have discriminating effects is the norm. That's the default. However, right, there are types of discrimination that we today, generally speaking, believe are inappropriate, that should not be the basis for discriminating between people in the way we write policy. But if we're going to consider those issues, we need to have some kind of system that steps us through how we evaluate discrimination and when that discrimination can be considered proper and legal and when it should be given a much sterner look. And so the history of Supreme Court cases on discrimination, although varied and at times very much recognizing discrimination today that we would find completely inappropriate, today is kind of in a position where it has a matrix or a scheme that it applies, right? Or it classifies discrimination. And with those different classifications of discrimination come different ways of evaluating whether the discrimination should be allowed or not allowed. And so we talked a little bit about discrimination rate based on what would be race or ethnicity, and how that they'd come up with a perspective of looking at it that said that, generally speaking, we don't think any classification or discrimination based on classification of race or ethnicity is ever going to be appropriate, right? And whereas they would have, for most kind of discriminations, they're going to look at things for trying to find some kind of rational governmental purpose. When they look at the ideas of race or ethnicity, the assumption from the court's perspective on this is that any classification in law that would recognize discrimination based upon race or ethnicity is going to be presumed arbitrary and presumed to be invalid, right? And so they set up what we call a compelling reason test or a compelling burden test that the government has to overcome if they're going to expect any law that they want to put into place is going to recognize race or ethnicity as a proper discrimination. They're going to have to overcome this compelling burden and reason that needs to be the case. So, right, it's almost impossible, right? And that's the way the courts looked at it. It's like, we believe you can't do this. You'll never be able to really show a compelling enough reason, but we're going to leave the door open just in case. Now, can you think historically of any time when we have been able to show, at least arguably show, a compelling reason? And we instituted discrimination based on race or ethnicity. Yes. Right. And what did we did this in World War II, right? We were at war with the Axis powers. Japan was part of the Axis powers. And folks of Japanese descent were living right in the United States. And we went in and we took their property and we rounded them up and we sent them off to internment camps, right? And we said that we had a compelling reason, national security. What have we said since then? We'll get to that one in just a second. What have we said since then about that action that we did in World War II? Anybody know historically? I know this is more history than it is political science at this point. Yeah, we have come back and admitted that that was an improper decision, that we treated those individuals, illegally and deprived them of their liberty and their property. So let's talk a little bit about the indigenous peoples. I did not grow up calling them that. I grew up calling them, right, American Indians to differentiate them from sub-Asian continent Indians, but indigenous peoples or first Americans, right, is another term that we're using now. Right, we grabbed all of those over a long period of history in the United States, forced those folks to leave everything behind and marched them off to essentially internment camps, right? The promise that we were giving them their own lands to live here, that we were resettling them. And we've had a real long history of instituting treaties between us and First American nations and then violating those treaties. And we are still doing this, right? Obviously, African Americans, right? We brought them over, right, away from their homelands to the United States, right, as slaves, had a whole institution of slavery that we subjected them through, right, for what, 140 years or something like that or more. And then, right, fought a civil war over it. After the Civil War, right, passed 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Constitution, to try to at least legally ensure, right, equal treatment in the law. Another century of, right, re-entrenching discriminatory statutes and actions in state law, tried to overcome that with laws in the mid to early 60s, right, with Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. And we're still struggling with the issue today, right? And we're still having issues where we can't live up to our ideals. Now, in all of those cases, the courts, right, have been developing in fits and starts, sometimes going a good direction and sometimes backsliding, right? So the Supreme Court has not been consistently, right, moving in one direction over time, but it is, right, starting, I think, to settle in with this classification idea, although they've been working on this classification idea now for a long time. And we haven't even got to talking about Americans with disabilities or sexual discrimination or age discrimination or gender discrimination, right? I mean, if we learn anything historically from this, not necessarily politically, but historically from this, is that we're really good at discriminating against each other for the slightest things that we find different. And that, that's a personal thing, that's an individual thing, but it makes it very, very difficult for any kind of systemic drive to be successful over time. And we see this, right, incredibly difficult historical process and political process playing out in the United States. And so, right, we need to understand that our politics and our history are really just reflections of what we as individuals are carrying with us through society. And we want to blame the government, or we want to blame a group of people. It's as much deeper than that, right? And so it's something we need to keep addressing and keep looking at and keep fighting. It's not something that you just wake up one morning, right? And if you've ever been a person discriminated against, you know this. It doesn't just happen all of a sudden. It's something that's been there that you've been struggling with, right? And you live with it day in and day out. And those of us, especially white guys, got it pretty easy, right? Got it pretty easy. So as far as that goes, um, and so it's not, and being the ones in power for all of this time, right? It's not something that we probably have wanted to bring to the forefront that often because it didn't affect us. And that's, I don't want to negate that or diminish that, but I will say that every group of people that are in power fight continually to hold that power and to diminish others that are struggling to get equal power. Right? That is, I think, a norm that is we can look at historically. So what that means is that this struggle is not going to go away. It's not something that's just going to dissipate. It's something that's it's a long haul for everybody, and those of you that are living it know that. So to get us back on the political science part of it, right, the courts as an institution have tried to come up with this process of looking at the type of discrimination that's being brought forward, keeping in the back of the mind that laws by their very definition will discriminate, and then try to figure out, well, is the discrimination proper? Is discrimination something that governments definitely should be allowed to do? Is it something maybe they should do? Is it something they should almost never be able to do? Right? And so they've come up with this comparison process of looking at the type of discrimination and then applying a standard to it based on the type of discrimination. So discriminations are classifications, legal classifications for discrimination that are based on race or ethnicity, get the highest protections by the court. And they say that those are going to be deemed arbitrary and invalid, and the government's going to have to prove a compelling reason. And national security, if it's true and correct, is probably a compelling state reason. National security would be one. What we, of course, realized with Japanese internment was that it wasn't necessary. There was no evidence or proof that any of our American citizens of Japanese descent were Japanese spies. They were Americans of Japanese descent, and that's the thing that we still struggle with. We're seeing it today in some instances with our Muslim citizens, and we want to discriminate based on their Muslim perspective, ignoring the fact that they're Americans, and that has to mean something too. Can we see a threat? Sure, we can see a threat. Could we see a national security threat? Sure, We experienced 9/11. That's right in our forefront of our mind. But it doesn't mean that we ignore what we're supposed to stand for here, and that's that, discrimination based on race or ethnicity, is something that should be absolutely the exception, not the norm, And so the idea here is that the government has to prove their case, and they have to prove it to a very high level before anything like this should be allowed to happen. It's a good idea. When those cases get to the Supreme Court, at least in the last few years, they've been pretty solid in the application of that criteria, but not always. And it's going to always be the case as humans interpret and apply the law that they will do it sometimes better and sometimes worse, One level below race and ethnicity classification, which is, where you need a compelling reason to do it, is gender discrimination. Gender discrimination, the courts have said, should receive moderate scrutiny, which is one level below, compelling scrutiny. And you have to show, not a compelling governmental relationship, but a substantive relationship, from the government. And we don't have a lot of cases that show a substantive relationship, because so many of the issues have been solved on different levels and looking for a substantive relationship, right, from the government's perspective. So what we look at instead is almost most of the cases we would look at would be cases of job discrimination, voting discrimination. Um, the voting discriminations were easy as far as the law goes, difficult because of implementation in society. The job discriminations were difficult in the legal side of things because you had to prove, right, it was the gender issue that was driving the differences or the discrimination. And we started to do better on that when we started to focus on uh, actual job tasks that needed to be completed and what was required to meet those job tasks. And as we started telling folks, look, write out the job description, tell us what needs to be done, what are the minimum requirements for this job. Well, once you started looking at that way, most of these issues start to solve themselves. But we know from doing sociological analysis, economic analysis, that there's still, right, gender discrimination in our society. Some of it is historical, it's still carrying forward, but some of it is still very much real today, right? Women do not make the same amount of money that men do for doing exactly the same job, right? Um, and there are arguments that go several different directions on that based upon family caregiving or childbearing or a lot of these issues that would be argued to interrupt a career process. But the fact is that if you're looking at, right, what the job requires and what can be delivered to meet the job, then you should move past that. Uh, the fact that we're not seeing it work that way says we've still got problems to solve here, right? So um, not an issue that we've completely worked our way around yet. Again, another one, we're slowly getting better, right? Um, Texas has been one of the places that's actually been a little bit better for gender discrimination because we brought a history of having women with power and property with us as a country and then a state, right? When we came out of the Mexico constitutional situation, we brought community property rights, and that ensured that a lot of women had the ability to hold power uh, and exercise that power because they had property and they owned property, um, which didn't exist in a lot of other states. So, Texas in that sense has a little better history on gender discrimination, which surprises people, right? They don't think of that. They think of, Texas being all about the cowboy, right? But there were a lot of cowgirls out there, not to be, using the boy girl thing in a bad way, but ranchers, right? There were women that owned their own ranches. Their husband and them had a ranch, and they would pass away, and the woman would be left because of the community property issue in Texas, owning that ranch and running that ranch. And some of those ranches were substantial pieces of the economic determination of a county or an area. And so those women were politically powerful in the state of Texas because they were the economic engine for a big part of that county. So in Texas, there are a lot of stories of strong women that you can look at that got involved in politics and involved in government a lot sooner. And so we've done a little better on that area than some of the other states have. Still issues there, obviously, and we have work to do. Other areas of discrimination that would receive a substantial relationship, would receive a concern from the government would be based on the third level down, which is a reasonableness level, a rational level to meet a governmental goal. And at this, we're going to start talking about things like age, right? This is where we see a lot of discrimination that when we look at it, we're like, well, yeah, that makes sense, and we're going to we're going to apply it, we're going to use it, and we're going to discriminate, right? Um, each of these time, each time there's an assertion of discrimination, whether it's based on age or gender or race or ethnicity, right? Whatever the discrimination challenge is, the court has to, at front, choose the appropriate uh, matrix to kind of to apply, right? They have to say, well, okay, you're bringing me a case based on LGBTQ, right? Discrimination. Is that a rational, reasonable level? Is that a substantial level? Is that a compelling level? Right. And so you have to fit that in there. You have to pick the right level, and the courts do that when they're trying to apply the law. Since LGBTQ is generally going to be gender based, it's going to probably fall under gender discrimination, receive moderate scrutiny, and require a substantial relationship. And so, right, but that case has to be made, right, at the beginning of a court case. You have to make that argument that this is the level of argument and discrimination that needs to be applied based on the type of discrimination that is being asserted and whether it's appropriate or not. So that's the first step of this, is trying to figure out that because discrimination is the norm when you write law, right? You're writing law to say this is what we're going to do and not this. You're discriminating against the not this side of things. Most of the time, right, that's just behavior or action or policy that isn't, right, identifiable or applicable to any group of people that may have had any kind of struggle for equality in our history. So if that's the case, you don't have to worry about it too much. But when the assertion then is like the policy you're putting into place is affecting this whole group of people that they're supposed to be, as American citizens, getting the equal protection of the law, then you start working up this three-pronged approach of compelling, substantive, or rational, right, as your relationship for the discrimination. Is this making sense? Yeah, I do this a little differently. Most people will focus on, right, the history of discrimination and move through the different groups that have been discriminated against. And to me, that's more history than it is the political perspective of it. So of how we've done it and what we look at as far as the legal elements of it. So I like to look at it for how we deal with the issue, and therefore, right, the history is there, and it's a long, slow, agonizing history of moving from discrimination to less. But where we are today is a position of trying to use this kind of matrix of application here to say some discrimination is always okay, some discrimination might be, some is almost never, and some we can't think of any, right? I mean, that's kind of where you're at as far as the levels go. And that's based upon who's being discriminated against and whether that history is there. And so it's a kind of different way of looking at it, but it's the way the courts do it. All right. So what I want you to do now, right, is to think of these examples here and then think of, right, is this discrimination that is allowed? And what's the level of scrutiny that gets applied to it, right? So, and let's assume historically we're talking today, not in the past. We're going to segregate school based on race. Would that be allowed? We have a nope. We have a nope and a no and a nope and a. So the answer is always no. See, this is the part I want you to start discriminating when you apply it, right? The answer is always maybe. So far, right, today, the answer is no. We haven't done it in a long time. But remember, right, if we go back a slide or two, right, It is presumed invalid. It is inherently suspect. And today the courts are saying no consistently. But is it possible that the government, sorry, is it possible that the government, the state, could come up with a compelling reason and we could discriminate, we could segregate schools based on race? The answer you have to give here is maybe. We don't know that yet, right? But they've left the door open. They haven't said if you use race, it's always no. They said if you use race, we're pretty sure it's no, but we'll let you make your argument. And if you can show us a compelling reason, right, that you should be allowed to do this, it's possible. Now, why would they do that? Because we don't know, right? Our assumption is, right, that you're not ever going to be able to make a racial or ethnic classification that's going to be upheld by the courts as proper. But they're going to look at the arguments, right? To date, have there been any classifications, right, that we're doing now that would be argued to be race or ethnically based that we've upheld? What about affirmative action? Right? Affirmative action is a case where, right, especially like a university situation or something, University of Texas is the one that's been involved in a lot of this, where they say, we're going to bring people of historically discriminated classes and we're going to make sure that we have a good representation of those classes in our university. Now, that means they're using race, the classification based on race or ethnicity, to put people in school. So the courts, right, when somebody challenges University of Texas and sues them over this because their child didn't get in and they're looking at these seats that, right, are being given to people of color, they're going to sue over that. The courts have said, okay, University of Texas is using an ethnicity-based policy to ensure that they get ethnic representation in their university. So we're going to have to presume that it's invalid and believe that it's inherently suspect. And University of Texas, you need to prove with a compelling reason why it's not. Okay, so University of Texas has to make the case, right, that there's a compelling reason for them to do this, that it makes sense, right, that those folks that think this is discrimination against them are just going to have to live with it. And here's why. And the case they've made is historic discrimination, right, is easily, we can point right at it and say, for this many years, we did not allow anybody of race or ethnic classification that wasn't, right, white to come into the University of Texas. We've got a history of this, and we're trying to fix this problem. So there's a compelling reason we want to fix the problem. There's a second compelling reason, though, and that is that the purpose of a university is to get people into a situation where they are encountering the world, where they are learning to apply critical thinking and problem solving skills and learning to work with everyone. And that's one of the overall arguments for having a campus where you have people together and interacting and living together on campus. That's part of the university and college experience a lot of times. And so the argument here is that all of this is very important to turning out people that understand how all the history has been, where we are today, where we can go from here and do better. And the courts have said generally that's a pretty compelling reason. And we're going to allow that to happen. And that's why you don't just say no in every instance or every situation, because there might be something like that. Now, generally speaking, 99% of the time, the courts have said no. But affirmative action is one of those ones where applying the standard, they said, you know what? Compelling reason shown, right? Discrimination, while we don't like the fact that it has to happen, there are a limited number of seats that the university can fill at a time. And these other ideas are big and important ideas that we need to allow, right, to be in there as well. So it's possible. We don't see it very often. And when we do see it, it's very, very divisive. It's not a policy that is easily put into place. There are challenges to it all of the time. Now, one of the things the courts have told us on that issue is that if it's not in a sense, a thoughtful approach, if they just say, look, we're going to set aside 15 seats for African Americans and 15 seats for Asian Americans and 15 seats for right, blah, 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 blah. That's not really right. Given a thoughtful approach to this, you're not making a good argument for what you need and why you need it. You're just setting up these classifications based on ethnicity. That's still not appropriate, right? They want to see more work than that going on if you're going to do this. And so, in that sense, right, the courts have required more uh, out of this kind of application of the law. So, does that make sense? Well, I mean, so go back to our slide, right? If I can get there. School segregation on race allowed? Yes, maybe. Depends on the circumstances. Do we segregate schools based on age? Yes, yes, right. We can make a pretty easily argument that, right, from the government's perspective, that this kind of discrimination needs to happen. Can you teach first grade through 12th grade in one room and do an okay job? We did, and almost all of our experiences said that that was not the best possible educational environment, right? If we could break it up based on age, maybe learning level that's tied to age, we could probably do better, right? And we did, and we have. And so what do we have? We have, right, elementary school, middle school, right? And that's, right, an application of discrimination based on age and education. So there had to be a good argument there to allow that to happen. Gender, do we have segregation, school segregation based on gender? We do. So having it this date and time means that there's probably been a good, reasonable, right, argument or a moderate scrutiny argument for it to be out there, right? I would make the argument that we should probably, and this is a personal perspective, we should probably do education based on gender earlier rather than, we tended to make the argument, oh, once the children started getting of age of sexual maturity, we split them up sometimes. I think it ought to be flipped all the way around. Was my phys ed class segregated? No. Mine was not, and I did it a long, long time ago. Actually, in junior high, mine was. The class was there, but they split us into two groups within the class, right? So yeah, there's a lot of that going on, right? But look at it this way: educational research shows us that women, girls at this point, the age I'm talking, right, learn faster and better and more completely when they're in their own gender groups than when they're having to slow down for the boys to keep up with them, right? So, right, we know that we could split up based on gender, and it would work better for both, right? And it would actually accentuate the faster learning speeds that women have before men do. I mean, we eventually kind of get there, right? But y'all run off and leave us on that mental development scale a lot sooner, right? Um, so facts are facts. Um, it's just true. Uh, which means if we're working all this out, we see statistic discrimination happening based on gender, because once you get to the higher levels of education, there's a lot more men there, right, still doing this and being successful at it than there are women. And yet y'all had in some instances had a leg up, and we're doing better sooner. And through some kind of systemic discrimination, I'm going to argue your educational development was somewhat slowed down to match you with the rest of the class, which meant the guys, for a while, right? So that's just, anyway, it's the way the world is still working, right? So it happens. Is it allowed? Can we do it? Yes, we can, right? Again, apply the right standard to see if it's appropriate or not. Can we segregate? Can we have job discrimination? Is that allowed? So the answer is always maybe, right? If the right argument can be made, right, for the situation, then we might allow it. So just keep in mind that there's no definitive no as a correct answer for this, right? We're looking at yeah, but, right, but if you can find a good reason here and there, right, that makes sense, that's going to help everybody, then you have to have the door open for that, and that's what the courts allow. But you have to make the case, right? So now, job discrimination has been falling away. Most of the time we did it in the past, we discriminated on jobs based on gender. We've moved away from that pretty well. Individuals still do it, and when they get sued for it, they generally lose. But from a societal wide perspective, we've gotten better at that because we've moved away from gender for the most case, and we've started looking, as I've mentioned earlier, at job task, and can you do the task? And if you can do the task, then obviously the gender didn't matter. Right, the job requirements. And one of the last real holdouts was for the gender one on that was job discrimination was women, right, being allowed into combat situations in the military, right? And we're still not completely open all the way to that, but most of it is now, right? We've got women that have been brought into based on capabilities and have gone through Army Ranger, Navy SEALs, things like that. And so, right, you're not going to get any more hardcore military get out and fight than those positions. And right, when we make them focus on job tasks, the women are getting there. So on the statistically better on shooting and sharpshooting, given the same training and the same equipment and all of that, the answer is generally yes. Not because they're just better shooters, but because your visual acuity is usually better, and your dexterity is a little better, right? So if you've ever shot guns, you know that you don't pull the trigger, you squeeze the trigger, right? And so squeezing requires a little more dexterity to be smooth. And so with better eyesight and a smoother pull on the trigger, women can shoot better because they don't move the gun as much. That being said, there are some guns that are going to move you, right? And so the women have to learn sometimes different ways of bracing themselves because these weapons are so powerful, and they don't have the body structure to. Some women do, right? to handle the impact of the weapon. But yeah, women make better surgeons than men for the exact same reason, right? Uh, Generally better acuity with their eyes and better dexterity with their fingers. So that means they can, right? If they're doing some very delicate scalpel work, I want a woman surgeon because I want the best case scenario for me and my nerves. Um, so at some point, let's say we extend that argument all the way out. Could you make the argument? And yes, she'll still get paid less. Working on it, right? We're working on it. We'll get there. But what if you can make the argument over time? Hey, women have better dexterity. Women have do learn faster. Women have better eyesight. Should we maybe discriminate against men from being in some of these areas? Paybacks are hell, right? The point is right that where I'm going with this is that this application of these different levels, right, will work regardless of which way the discrimination goes, right? And so it is a more fair system to say, okay, let's look at it, right? Lauren, right answer, maybe. Let's look at it. Maybe at some point we can make the strong argument that men shouldn't be doing a job because of inherent limitations. We'll see, right? Not there yet, but it's possible. Racial discrimination allowed? Right answer is maybe. Still maybe, right? They're all maybe. It's a much harder level to meet for a good argument to have it, and right? But remember, the affirmative action is kind of that way. So maybe. Religious discrimination, right answer? Maybe, right? Sometimes, right, we want to say society can handle this disruption and we should let people practice, right, the way they want to. And sometimes we say no, that goes too far, right? So right now, right, we discriminate against those folks that would have a religious perspective of wanting to have multiple spouses, right? Trying to be gender neutral in this one. Historically has been multiple wives, but why, right? Why couldn't you go another way if your religion said that? Well, right now the law is pretty much no, right? But you could make the argument that maybe it makes more sense, and we actually have historical examples, right, where societies have actually worked a little better with, right, multiple spouses in the mix, but they didn't have the religious perspective that our society has. So, given our religious perspective, we're not going that direction. So, again, all of these, right, are perspectives that we can look at, examples that we can look at, and start trying to apply these, right, compelling reason, compelling scrutiny, moderate scrutiny, reasonableness level scrutiny, right, depending upon the type of discrimination that's being offered up. But the answer is never just straight out of the box no. It's maybe let's look at the facts. Right? Let's look at the argument. Right. And so that's why I like to go through these just to make you keep thinking about what we're doing here. So now we've put laws into place to try to eliminate discrimination where we've come to the conclusion through the courts that it doesn't apply. Right? Historically, we look back, we have the courts telling us racial discrimination is okay at some points, right? And then later, right, coming back and saying no, not the case. These laws here were legislation passed by the U.S. Congress, signed by the president in 64, 65, and 68. Because we were seeing racial discrimination, they applied, right, the compelling standard and said, no, doesn't work, right? These are, Civil Rights Act. Racial discrimination is illegal in all places of public accommodation. You cannot make a good argument, right, for saying that in a public space we should racially segregate or we should racially uh, exclude, right? Um, 65, right? The Voting Rights Act, trying to simply, right, get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments working, right? Is what 64, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are doing, right? Uh, we'd already passed the amendments, right? But the South in particular, but not only the South, right, had put in a lot of policy, a lot of law, a lot of practice, a lot of abuse, right, to prevent people of color from being able to exercise their right to vote, be able to exercise their right to be in public and be treated fairly. And so this is the federal Congress trying to legislate that change as well. Um, as you can see, if you're looking around today, we're still fighting these issues, right? Just the fact that we pass laws at the legislative side of things doesn't mean that we got anywhere close yet to necessarily making sure society works that way, right? Um, so we're still, right, as a society trying to deal with these issues and work these out and make them, our society, more equal and better. And we're not there yet. We're just not there yet. And people are suffering because of that. All right, U.S. citizens are suffering, are not getting the right to act as whole and unique and individual people in our society, like so many others of us are. And we got to keep working these issues. Um, and this racial discrimination, voting barriers, right, housing discrimination, they're all still there, right? We're either still seeing them actively happening or we're still living with the results of them. So, Voting Rights Act, right? All barriers that the states have put into place to keep people from voting based on race, ethnicity, we're supposed to, right, that outlaw. But we still struggle, right? Texas is one of the places we're having some big issues with this right now. It's not so blatant as we say, oh, look at the color of your skin. Well, you don't get to vote. It's not that blatant, but it still happens, right? So in 2017, 15, this is why I'm not a historian because the years go by. Texas passed the voter ID law legislation. And the idea behind it was is that everyone that was going to vote, right, needed to have a voter ID issued by the state of Texas. I'll stop real quick. What you got, Andrea?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, thank you for asking. So I'm sorry to go off topic well, stay on topic, but I just wanted to share this because I thought it was interesting. I was walking past like a voter, like one of those little stands, a kiosk where they said, well, make sure you register to vote.
Right. Voter registration. Right.
Yeah, so I've always voted in Texas for the last 20 years. I've just never had a problem. I've always just, go and vote. And on a hunch, I decided to check my voter registration status. And guess what? It was not, I was not a registered voter. So I don't know what went wrong, but thankfully I found out in time and then I was able to fill out like reapply or whatever, and now I've checked
Mm-hmm.
and now I'm a registered voter again, but I think that's a little suspicious.
Why do you think for you it was suspicious?
Because like I said, I've been voting with no
Have you moved
problem.
recently?
Yeah, I voted in like the primaries. I've like yeah, within yeah. So and I've lived at this same address for like 5 years and never had a problem. So I was really
Yeah.
suspicious because that's the first time that's ever happened to me in all these years. And hmm, we're coming up on
Hmm.
a pretty important election, and I just found it to be really suspicious that suddenly I was not a registered voter. Like that just seemed really like weird.
Yeah. So I mean, so here's Yes, and that's called motor voter legislation, right? All the states are required to offer voter registration when you renew or get your license, your driver's license, as a way to try to solve some of these historical issues, right? And the reason that works is because there's a congruence between when you need to get a new driver's license and when you need to renew your voter registration, right? Um, if you move, especially out of county to a different county, right, that's going to invalidate your voter registration. And you're required by law to have a valid driver's license showing your current place of that you live. So, right, as you go to get your new driver's license, right, we've through federal law, right, implemented this process where they're supposed to ask you, okay, you've just moved, you're getting your driver's license. Do you want to renew your voter registration because you might have moved outside of the county, right? And that's a way that we're trying to put a process into place to try to keep people registered. On the other side of it, right, is we have a responsibility to move people off of the rolls, right, that haven't voted for a certain amount of time. We are supposed to move people who have passed away off of the rolls, right, so that those voter rolls reflect people living in those areas that are registered to vote, that are eligible to vote, right? And we can try to have some kind of continuity there. But then we pass legislation like voter ID law, which requires you to go get a state issued photo ID to use when you do go vote, right? Well, how do we make sure that we do that fairly for everybody, that everybody has the right opportunity and access to get that new piece of voter identification, that new driver's license or state issued ID, right? Um, and when Texas did it, we just said, here's a timeline. This needs to be taken care of. Y'all need to get this by here, right? Well, then we said, here are the pieces of documentation you need to have with you to prove that you're eligible to vote in Texas. One of them was a birth certificate. There are a whole bunch of people that don't have birth certificates of a certain age, of a certain race, right? Of a certain economic level. They weren't born in hospitals. Or the hospitals, when they were born far enough back in time, the hospitals didn't put out, right, birth certificates. And so they don't actually have one, but the state was then requiring that you show one to be able to get this voter ID that was going to let you vote. So the people that was affecting, right, were identifiable as groups that have been historically discriminated against. And the court said to Texas, that ain't going to fly, unconstitutional. Go back and fix it. Now, if you're Texas and your focus is on voter integrity, right, that maybe we've had people voting that shouldn't, we've got a lot of folks that shouldn't and have had in the past, is the argument. It's not, but it might be the argument. Could you implement this so that it wasn't discriminatory? Yes, it's really, really simple, right? We used to have this thing. How many of y'all remember bookmobiles? Anybody know what those were? Bookmobiles? I'm reaching back a little while, right? We used to have libraries that get a big van and they'd load books up in the van and they'd go to neighborhoods where people didn't have easy transportation, right? And park the bookmobile there and people could come check books out of the library through this van. They were delivering the service to the people that couldn't get to where the library was. It was cool, actually. We could have done the same thing in Texas with a D van. We could have had vans that had everything they needed in them and sent them out to all the neighborhoods saying, hey, we're going to be here on this date and time. You want to come get your voter ID? We'll be there. That would have gone a long way to making sure that we were really focused on the integrity of making sure that people got the identification so they could vote versus, right, putting a system in place that exacerbated old historical, right, discriminatory issues. So the real question was, well, what was the intent of this law? Voter security or voter suppression? And the court says, man, it looks like suppression to us right now, right? So you got to be careful with those things, right? We just had the governor, right, make a decision last week about drop off ballot boxes, right? Now this is a little of a different situation because you're not required by law to have those boxes necessarily, and this was something that was being allowed because of COVID. And then all of a sudden the governor says, well, let's just have one per county. That way we can make sure we have enough people watching the box, ensuring, checking the people's ID as they come in, that that's their ballot and they're putting it in the box and it's all safe and secure. So who's that going to impact the most? Counties with tons and tons of people or a really, really big area, right? They're going to have a whole lot harder experience using one box to drop things in versus maybe putting them around the county in 15 or 20 different places. And so, he implemented this policy. He's being sued, right? Obviously. Yeah, Houston is the ground zero for this. Houston, 1,500 square miles of area, 4 million people. Let's say conservatively 20% of them want to do a mail-in drop-off ballot, and you got one box in Houston. Yeah, it's going to disenfranchise or right suppress a lot of people maybe from wanting to take the effort to do that, which is going to drive more of them that do want to vote to have to stand in line and then risk maybe their health to do that. So you got to ask yourself, what's the real idea behind these? And if there's not a good, reasonable, or good moderate argument or compelling argument, depending upon the type of discrimination that you're asserting, right, then the court should be trying to knock this down. The Open Housing Act. Before I move on, we're still talking voting. I'll stop here for a second. I'm trying to see if there's anything that you said or asked that I didn't address. I would assert that some of the government is afraid. Some of the folks in government are trying their level best to ensure that all people get the right to vote, and some of them are trying their best to not. And I guess it all depends. It may depend upon your personal prejudice, or it may depend on the perspective of who's gaining and who's losing power. Right, when that happens, I think a lot of it is some of both, to be honest, and the power will never underestimate, people that have power that will do almost anything to keep it. And if they perceive equality, the extension of equality, the extension of voting rights to more people will damage their power, then they're going to be against it. And that's because people are not always nice. Some people are just that way. So yes, I think there are some parts of government that are. Now you can be just as suspicious of those that want to extend it sometimes, right? Because you could say, well, they're going to gain power if they get it extended. If there's more equality, they'll gain power. That's the only reason they want to do it. So I mean, that argument goes both ways. But the fact of the matter is that the arc of history for the United States, although slow, has been one moving toward equality. From where we started off to where we are today, we're better, incrementally and slowly, and it's certainly we're not there yet. We started off with free white men who owned property of a certain age, right? So we're a lot better than that now, but we're still not there, right? Ideally, we'll get to the point where it's going to be people of a certain age, right? That are U.S. citizens of a certain age. That's it, right? Um, yeah, we've got some other stuff there too, right? We've got laws in place that restrict the privilege of voting, the right of voting to non felons, people that are currently not in jail, right? And even then, there's some hurdles, some big hurdles for people to get that right back after they get out of jail. States in the past have had laws on the books that said that once you were a convicted felon, you could never vote again. Um, and that seems uh, pretty harsh for most felonious uh, convictions. I mean, I don't know as a personal perspective if if you've got a murder one conviction, whether I'm all that concerned if you're voting going forward. But should you lose your right to vote for other felonies? I don't know, right? I mean, that's probably not. And the argument over time has been we've been reducing that. Um, and that most states now have laws on the books so that most people who are convicted felons, once they've paid their time and paid their fines, get the right to vote back. Um, you still lose it forever in Kentucky. So, okay, so we're still, some states are there. And um, the other thing is that we've put the burden of getting that right back on the people. So we don't tell them how to do it a lot of times. We certainly don't help them as they're coming out of prison to start the process a lot of times. And so that's raising the bar for them to get that vote back because they have to go do all of this work on the front end to get there. And so you can argue that that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? Um, Yeah, I mean, most states have got to that position where if you've served your entire sentence, you should get your rights back. Um, we're seeing this work its way out in Florida right now, right? In Florida, they were a state that said that you were a convicted felon, you didn't get your right to vote. They passed a legislation, constitutional amendment, if I remember correctly, in Florida. So it went to the people, and the people of Florida said, you pay your time, you do your time, you get your right to vote back. The state legislature then passed a law that says, well, yes, you get it back when you've done your time and you've paid all your fines and fees, right? So that you don't owe the state time or money. Um, and that was upheld in the courts as legitimate to put that condition on there. And then um, Bloomberg, right out of New York, billionaire Bloomberg, who had been running for president, organized a situation where people donated money to pay all of those fines and fees back so those people would be eligible to vote in Florida. Um, and now the state attorney general in Florida it's been announced, I don't know if they're actually doing it, but it's been announced that they're going to investigate whether that's actually um, some kind of voter fraud for someone to come in and pay their fees and fines. Um, so we'll see where that goes. So we're still living in a time where you got to look at these things. You got to pay attention to these things, right? Discrimination is still happening. It's happening on a little more discrete level sometimes than we're paying attention to. Although some of these examples I'm giving you are not all that discrete. So let me ask you a different question. We'll move on to the Open Housing Act of '68, right, which was trying to prevent and forbid discrimination based on race for leasing houses and selling houses and leasing apartments and things like that. How many of y'all have heard the term they live on the wrong side of the tracks, right? Or that's the wrong side of town for you to be on, right? Yeah, we know, right, that we see, right, segregation in our society about where we live based on color and based on economics, right? It's there. It's easily identifiable. And I'll tell you that for the longest time, I always thought that that was just the way things were, that people chose that, right? I was ignorant to the history of this, right? And growing up, I was on the wrong side of the tracks. Um, but as I saw, what the other side of the tracks looked like, I was like, well, why am I not over there? Why are all of those over there and I'm not, right? So in my instance, it was economic, right? But of people of color that were living all around me, they didn't really have a choice, and I thought they were in the same situation I was. That it was, well, this is where we can afford to live, and then you come to find out that the history, right, of suburbia, the history of lending and lending policy through banks, through the federal government, through state government has been discriminatory in its history, right? The very first subdivision, right, built by a developer, but his last name was Levitt in New York, and it's known as Levittown, right? Very first real subdivision. Um, the federal government, right, through its lending program, had a clause in there. This is in the 40s, I believe. Had a clause in there that the developer would look to the harmony of the community when selling these properties, or they wouldn't get the ability to loan the money for the government to develop these properties. Levitt, right, understood that harmony of the community meant all one color, white. And that was, right, the norm, right, of how things went for developers across the United States for, 70, 80 years, right? There were these clauses in there from both federal lending programs and state lending programs, and that the developers had to ensure this kind of harmony or equality, blah, 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 when it meant segregation. So that's not even, we don't even usually think of it from that perspective. We think of, right, the Housing Act here as discrimination of where if I'm a person of color and I go to bank to try to get a loan to buy a house, they say no to me because of my color at the bank and won't let me get a loan there. That was happening too, right? That's why we had the Open Housing Act of 68. But we also had it happening on the developmental side of things, right? Before you even got a chance, right? As someone that was wanting to buy a house. And so this existed all over. The other thing I ignorantly thought was that this was probably something that was mainly happening in the South, and that's not true. It was countrywide, right? So a lot of this living on the run side of the tracks is because we designated sides of the tracks for people, right, through law and through process and through practice, um, and that has profound long-term effects, right? Because getting a house, and at some point, right, owning that house provides an economic stability for a family that transmits generation to generation. And so, even though we maybe have been trying to fix the discrimination issues with education and voting and things like that, these economic ones, right, are still kind of, right, we're still seeing the effects of them. Um, and at some point, in a sense, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're, right, through these kind of policy perspectives, right, segregating neighborhoods, at some point, right, it becomes just a de facto situation, right? If you're of this color, you live here. If you're this color, you live over here, and the segregation starts happening through people's actions, and it doesn't have to be reinforced anymore, right? It has, but it's you're talking real estate. You're talking something that's very slow moving, And so when you own property, let's say you take let's take Austin, for example, right? Where's the segregation happen in Austin? Geographically speaking, can you draw a line where the tracks are in Austin? East side, right? Basically, I-35 historically, east of I-35, right? People of color, right? West of I-35, less color, right? That's where it is, right? And that's the same thing that happened here as well. Austin was not exempt from any of this, right? And that's true from city to city to city across the country. I'm actually, if you're interested in this topic, I don't know that y'all can see this. This is a book called The Color of Law, written by a guy named Richard Rothstein, who, right, Distinguished Fellow of Economic Policy, Emeritus Senior Fellow of Thurgood Marshall Institute for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. This whole book is about our segregated history in the United States and how policy, process, and law was used to define what the right side of the tracks versus the other side of the tracks was. Right? Incredibly enlightening piece of research, really well done. To be fair, I have to say that I read it right before I go to bed because although it's interesting, it does also help lower your blood pressure, right? As far as you're reading something fairly dry. If you're thinking about the discrimination that's going on, though, it keeps you up a little later. But a very interesting book if this is the kind of thing that interests you, called The Color of Law. Its subtitle is The Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. All right, I am out of time for the day, so I'm going to shut up here. We've got a couple minutes. Any questions to end out the day?